The autumn rain pelted the tall windows of the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse with relentless fury, each droplet exploding against the glass like tiny bullets. Detective Sarah Martinez shifted uncomfortably in the hard plastic chair of the family court waiting room, her eyes never leaving the small figure hunched in the corner. 3-year-old Emma Chun sat motionless, her tiny legs barely reaching the edge of the oversized chair, clutching a threadbare stuffed bunny that had clearly seen better days. The rabbit's once pink fur had faded to a dingy beige, and one of its button eyes hung by a single thread, swaying gently with each of Emma's shallow breaths. 6 months. That's how long it had been since that horrific October night when everything changed. 6 months since Emma's world exploded in a symphony of screeching tires, shattering glass, and screaming sirens. 6 months since she became the sole survivor of a collision that claimed the lives of her parents, Dr. Michael Chun and kindergarten teacher Lisa Chun. 6 months of complete, absolute silence from the only witness who could ensure that drunk driver Marcus Sullivan would pay for his crimes. Sarah's K-9 partner, Rex, a magnificent German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a coat that gleamed like polished mahogany, lay at her feet with unusual restlessness. Normally, the 4-year-old police dog was the epitome of discipline and focus, trained to detect narcotics, track suspects, and maintain perfect composure in any situation. But today, something was different. His ears remained perpetually perked, and his gaze kept drifting toward the silent child across the room. "She hasn't spoken a single word since that night," whispered Carol Peterson, Emma's temporary foster mother, dabbing at her red-rimmed eyes with a tissue that had seen too much use. Carol had been caring for Emma through the state's emergency placement program, but the strain was evident in every line of her weathered face. Not to me, not to the social workers, not even to Dr. Martinez, the child psychologist. It's like her voice just disappeared. Sarah nodded grimly, remembering the crime scene photos that still haunted her dreams. The Chun family had been returning from Emma's cousin's birthday party when Marcus Sullivan, with a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit, ran a red light at 60 miles per hour. His massive pickup truck had T-boned their small sedan on the passenger side, where Emma's car seat was positioned. The impact had been so severe that first responders initially believed there were no survivors. Miraculously, Emma had emerged, with only minor physical injuries, a few bruises, a small cut on her forehead, and a sprained wrist. But the psychological trauma ran deeper than any visible wound. Dr. Patricia Wells, the court-appointed child psychologist, had diagnosed Emma with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and selective mutism, a condition where trauma victims lose the ability to speak in certain situations, despite being physically capable of speech. The waiting room buzzed with the quiet conversations of lawyers, social workers, and court officials preparing for what promised to be a challenging hearing. Marcus Sullivan's defense attorney, Robert Chun, no relation to the victims despite sharing their surname, had already filed multiple motions to prevent Emma from testifying, arguing that a traumatized 3-year-old's testimony would be unreliable and potentially coached. But Emma was more than just a witness. She was the prosecution's entire case. Physical evidence could prove that Sullivan was drunk and that he had run the red light. Traffic cameras had captured the collision from multiple angles. But Emma's testimony could provide the crucial human element that would ensure Sullivan faced the maximum penalty for his 3rd DUI offense. Under Arizona's harsh repeat offender laws, a conviction for vehicular homicide while intoxicated could mean life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Sarah watched Emma, she noticed something remarkable happening. Rex had begun to inch closer to the child, his movements so subtle that most people in the room hadn't noticed. The dog's training should have kept him perfectly stationary, But something about Emma was calling to him on a level that transcended his professional discipline. Emma's dark eyes, which had remained fixed on the floor for most of the morning, suddenly lifted and met Rex's gentle gaze. For the first time since Sarah had arrived, the child's expression changed. The mask of emptiness that had covered her features for months seemed to crack, revealing a flicker of curiosity beneath. Rex's tail began a slow, almost imperceptible wag, not the enthusiastic greeting he typically reserved for friendly strangers, but something softer, more understanding. His amber eyes seemed to communicate a message that transcended species. I see you. I understand. You're safe. Dr. Wells, who had been reviewing her notes in preparation for the hearing, looked up and froze. In her 20 years of working with traumatized children, she had never seen Emma respond to anyone or anything with such immediate recognition. The child's grip on her stuffed bunny loosened slightly, and her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid all morning, began to slow. My God, Dr. Wells whispered, causing several heads to turn in her direction. Look at her. Sarah followed the psychologist's gaze and felt her breath catch in her throat. Emma was leaning forward in her chair, her small hand extended toward Rex as if drawn by an invisible force. The dog, sensing the child's tentative invitation, rose slowly to his feet and took a single, careful step in her direction. The room fell silent as everyone became aware of the extraordinary moment unfolding before them. Here was a child who had rejected every human attempt at connection, every offer of comfort and support, reaching out to a police dog with the first sign of trust she had shown since the accident. As Rex moved closer, Emma's eyes began to fill with tears, not the empty, hollow tears that her foster mother had described, but something different, something that looked almost like hope. The rain continued to pound against the courthouse windows, but inside the waiting room, something magical was beginning to bloom. A connection that would soon change not only Emma's life, but the entire course of justice itself. The fluorescent lights of the district attorney's conference room cast harsh shadows across the polished mahogany table where prosecutor Amanda Foster spread out crime scene photographs like a grim puzzle. 3 days had passed since the remarkable moment in the courthouse waiting room, and the legal team was deep in pre-trial preparations that would determine the fate of Marcus Sullivan. The room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major case. Paralegal assistants organized evidence files. Detective Martinez reviewed witness statements, and Dr. Patricia Wells studied Emma's psychological evaluation reports. Emma sat in a small chair specially brought in for the occasion, her legs swinging freely as she absently stroked her beloved bunny's matted fur. The child welfare supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, had insisted that Emma be present for these preparatory meetings to help her become comfortable with the legal environment before the actual trial. It was a calculated risk, exposing a traumatized child to the stark realities of legal proceedings, but Dr. Wells believed that familiarity might ease Emma's anxiety when the crucial moment arrived. Rex lay beside Detective Martinez's chair, his massive frame occupying a significant portion of the floor space. The German shepherd appeared to be resting, but his amber eyes tracked Emma's every movement with the intensity of a guardian angel. Something had fundamentally shifted in the dynamic between the child and the dog since their first encounter. Rex, who had been trained to remain focused solely on his handler during work situations, seemed magnetically drawn to the small girl. The defense is going to argue that Emma's testimony is unreliable due to her age and trauma, Amanda Foster explained, her voice carrying the weight of years spent prosecuting difficult cases. We need to establish that, despite her silence, she's mentally competent and aware of what happened that night. Dr. Wells nodded, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she consulted her notes. Emma's cognitive abilities are actually quite advanced for her age. Before the accident, She was speaking in complete sentences, could count to 20, and knew her alphabet. The selective mutism is purely trauma-related, not developmental. As the adults continued their discussion, something extraordinary began to unfold across the room. Emma had grown restless listening to the serious adult conversations. She couldn't understand. With the impulsiveness typical of a 3-year-old, she slipped down from her chair and began wandering around the conference room, her bunny dragging behind her on the carpet. Janet Rodriguez started to intervene, but Dr. Wells raised a gentle hand to stop her. "Let's see what she does," the psychologist whispered, recognizing the potential significance of Emma's first self-directed action in months. Emma's wandering brought her directly to where Rex lay beside Detective Martinez's chair. The massive dog, who could easily weigh 3 times as much as the tiny child, remained perfectly still as she approached. His training had taught him to assess threats and respond accordingly, but every instinct in his canine brain recognized that this small human posed no danger, quite the opposite. The room fell silent as Emma knelt beside Rex, her small hand reaching out tentatively to touch his thick fur. The moment her fingers made contact with his coat, something remarkable happened. Rex's tail began a slow, gentle wag, and he shifted his position to make himself more accessible to the child. It was a movement so subtle that only those who knew dogs well would recognize its significance. Rex was offering himself as a source of comfort. Dr. Wells barely dared to breathe as she observed the interaction. In her extensive experience with traumatized children, she had seen many therapeutic interventions fail to break through the walls that trauma builds. Play therapy, art therapy, even specialized treatment with trained counselors had made little impact on Emma's selective mutism. Yet here was a police dog, with no formal therapy training, creating a connection that months of professional intervention had failed to achieve. Emma's exploration of Rex's fur became more confident. She ran her small fingers through the thick coat around his neck, marveling at its texture. Rex responded by gently lowering his massive head, bringing himself closer to her level. His amber eyes, usually alert and intense during working situations, had taken on an almost tender quality as he gazed at the traumatized child. Then came the moment that would change everything. As Emma continued to stroke Rex's fur, her carefully constructed emotional barriers began to crack. Tears that had been held back by months of psychological protection started to flow down her cheeks, not the hollow, empty tears that her foster mother had described, but real, cathartic sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of her wounded soul. Without warning, Emma threw her small arms around Rex's neck and buried her face in his thick fur. The massive police dog, trained to apprehend criminals and detect contraband, became as gentle as a lamb. He remained completely still, allowing the grieving child to use him as an anchor in her sea of trauma. "My God," Dr. Wells whispered, her professional composure cracking as she witnessed something she had only read about in psychology journals. "She's never approached anyone like this. Not her foster parents, not me, not any of the social workers." Detective Martinez felt tears prick her own eyes as she watched her partner transform into something beyond his professional training. Rex seemed to understand, on some primal level, that this small human needed something that no amount of police training could provide: pure, unconditional acceptance and protection. Amanda Foster quietly set down her legal files, recognizing that what they were witnessing transcended the boundaries of their criminal case. Court reporter Janet Williams, who had seen countless legal proceedings over her 20-year career, found herself reaching for tissues as she watched the profound connection unfold. For nearly 10 minutes, Emma remained pressed against Rex's comforting bulk, her small body shaking with months of suppressed grief and trauma. Rex never moved, never shifted his weight, never gave any indication that he was anything other than completely devoted to providing whatever comfort this broken child needed. When Emma finally pulled back from Rex's embrace, her face was streaked with tears, but something fundamental had changed in her expression. The empty, hollow look that had haunted her features for months was replaced by something that looked almost like hope. And for the first time since the accident, Emma Chun smiled. The mahogany-paneled chambers of the Honorable Judge William Sullivan echoed with heated arguments as the most unusual motion in Arizona. Legal history played out before his bench. Outside, October winds rattled the courthouse windows, while inside, the fate of an unprecedented legal request hung in the balance. Defense attorney Robert Chun stood at the podium, his face flushed with indignation, while prosecutor Amanda Foster clutched a thick folder of research that could change courtroom proceedings forever. "Your Honor," Chun's voice carried the sharp edge of a man who had built his career on technicalities. Allowing a police dog in the courtroom during testimony is not only unprecedented, it's prejudicial beyond measure. My client, Marcus Sullivan, has the constitutional right to a fair trial, not a circus atmosphere designed to evoke sympathy for the prosecution. Judge Sullivan, no relation to the defendant despite sharing the name, leaned back in his leather chair, studying the mountain of legal briefs that had landed on his desk over the past week. At 62, he had presided over thousands of cases during his 20-year tenure on the bench, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The Emma Chun case had already attracted national attention, with legal scholars debating the intersection of animal-assisted therapy and criminal justice proceedings. "Mr. Chun," the judge replied carefully, "while I appreciate your concerns about prejudicial impact, I'm more interested in hearing about precedent. Has any court in the United States ever allowed a therapy animal to assist a child witness during testimony?" Chun shuffled through his papers with visible frustration. "That's exactly my point, Your Honor. There is no precedent because it's never been considered appropriate. We're talking about a police dog, an animal trained to attack suspects, detect drugs, and intimidate criminals. How can the jury possibly remain objective when faced with such obvious emotional manipulation?" Amanda Foster rose smoothly, her years of prosecutorial experience evident in her measured response. "Your Honor, if I may address the court's question about precedent." She opened her folder, revealing months of exhaustive research. While no court has specifically allowed a police dog to assist a child witness, there are 17 documented cases across 12 states where certified therapy animals have been permitted in family court proceedings involving traumatized minors. The courtroom's atmosphere grew electric as Foster continued. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have compelling expert testimony from Dr. Patricia Wells, one of the nation's leading authorities on childhood trauma and selective mutism. Her evaluation clearly demonstrates that Emma Chun's connection with Detective Martinez's canine partner represents the first breakthrough in her treatment since the accident that claimed her parents' lives." Judge Sullivan studied the psychological evaluation reports spread before him. Emma's file painted a heartbreaking picture, a brilliant, articulate 3-year-old reduced to complete silence by witnessing the violent deaths of her parents. Night terrors, regression in toilet training, refusal to eat, all classic symptoms of severe PTSD in young children. Dr. Wells' report indicates that the child has shown no positive response to traditional therapy methods. Foster continued, her voice gaining strength. No response to play therapy, art therapy, or even specialized trauma counseling. Yet in the presence of Rex, Emma demonstrates measurable improvements in stress indicators, social engagement, and emotional regulation. Robert Chun scoffed audibly. "Your Honor, we're expected to believe that a dog can heal psychological trauma that trained professionals cannot address. This is pseudoscience at best, and at worst, it's a calculated attempt to prejudice the jury against my client." What Chun didn't mention, What he couldn't afford to acknowledge was how devastating Emma's potential testimony could be. His client, Marcus Sullivan, was a repeat offender with a history that read like a prosecutor's dream case. 3 previous DUI convictions, 2 hit-and-run incidents, and a pattern of reckless behavior that painted him as exactly the kind of dangerous drunk driver that mandatory sentencing laws were designed to stop. Judge Sullivan turned his attention to the case files documenting Sullivan's criminal history. The defendant had been driving on a suspended license with a blood alcohol content of 0.24, 3 times the legal limit when he ran the red light that October night. Traffic cameras had captured every horrifying second of the collision that destroyed the Chun family. Mr. Chun, the judge said slowly, while I understand your concerns about the unusual nature of this request, I'm more troubled by your client's history. This is his 4th DUI offense. Under Arizona's repeat offender statute, a conviction for vehicular homicide while intoxicated carries a mandatory sentence of 25 years to life. The weight of those words settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Everyone present understood the stakes. Emma's testimony wasn't just about justice for her parents. It was about preventing Marcus Sullivan from ever having the opportunity to kill again. Foster seized the moment. Your Honor, the prosecution isn't asking for special treatment or emotional manipulation. We're simply requesting that a traumatized child be given the same consideration that this court would provide for any witness with special needs. Emma Chun is the sole surviving witness to a crime that claimed 2 innocent lives. She deserves the opportunity to have her voice heard. Dr. Wells' research folder contained something even more compelling: video documentation of Emma's sessions with Rex. The footage showed a remarkable transformation. A child who had been essentially catatonic, finding moments of peace and even joy in the presence of the gentle police dog. Judge Sullivan had watched those videos 3 times each, viewing more powerful than the last. He had seen Emma's first smile in months, witnessed her tentative attempts to communicate through gestures and facial expressions when Rex was present. Most importantly, he had observed the dog's extraordinary intuition in responding to the child's emotional needs. The court recognizes, Judge Sullivan finally announced, his voice carrying the gravity of a decision that would be studied in law schools for decades to come, that this case presents unique circumstances that require careful consideration of both legal precedent and humanitarian concerns. The packed courtroom held its breath as the judge continued. After reviewing all submitted materials, expert testimonies, and legal briefs, this court will allow the presence of Detective Martinez's K-9 partner during Emma Chun's testimony, subject to strict conditions. Robert Chun's face went ashen as the implications hit him. Amanda Foster struggled to maintain her professional composure, but her slight smile betrayed her satisfaction. However, Judge Sullivan's voice cut through. A courtroom buzz. The dog must remain completely passive and controlled at all times. Any sign of aggression, distraction, or inappropriate behavior will result in immediate removal. This is not a therapy session. It's a court of law. Outside the courthouse, news vans lined the street as reporters prepared to broadcast the unprecedented decision to a fascinated nation. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 4A as the most anticipated trial in Arizona's recent history prepared to unfold. By 7:30 a.m., 2 hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin, a crowd had already gathered outside the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse. News crews from CNN, Fox News, and local stations had established a media circus on the courthouse steps, their satellite trucks creating a technological forest of antennas and cables stretching down Central Avenue. Inside the courthouse, security had been tripled. Metal detectors buzzed constantly as courthouse staff screened an endless stream of legal professionals, journalists, and curious citizens, hoping to witness what legal scholars were already calling the Emma Chon precedent. The gallery seats, normally half empty for most criminal proceedings, had been claimed by 6 a.m. by a mixture of victims' rights advocates, child welfare specialists, and legal observers from as far away as Harvard Law School. Detective Sarah Martinez stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, her hand resting protectively on Rex's head as they prepared for the most important moment of both their careers. The German Shepherd, normally unflappable in high-stress situations, seemed to sense the extraordinary nature of the day. His amber eyes scanned the bustling corridor with heightened awareness, and his ears remained perpetually alert to every sound and movement around them. "Are you ready for this, boy?" Sarah whispered, running her fingers through Rex's thick coat. The dog looked up at her with those intelligent eyes that had seen drug busts, dangerous arrests, and countless crime scenes, but nothing that compared to the responsibility they faced today. Rex would not be tracking criminals or detecting contraband today. His job was far more delicate and infinitely more important. At 8:45 a.m., a black sedan pulled up to the courthouse's side entrance, away from the media frenzy at the front steps. Carol Peterson, Emma's foster mother, emerged first, her face drawn with exhaustion from sleepless nights, spent comforting a traumatized child plagued by nightmares. Behind her came Dr. Patricia Wells, carrying a leather briefcase filled with psychological evaluation reports and therapeutic strategies developed specifically for this unprecedented situation. Finally, Emma Chun stepped out of the car. The 3-year-old wore a simple navy blue dress that Carol had purchased specifically for the occasion, along with white tights and small black shoes that clicked softly against the courthouse marble. Her hair, jet black and silky, had been pulled back into 2 small pigtails, secured with blue ribbons that matched her dress. In her arms, she clutched her beloved stuffed bunny, its threadbare fur and missing button eye telling the story of months of desperate comfort-seeking. Emma's dark eyes, which had once sparkled with the innocent joy typical of toddlers, now carried a weight that no child should bear. Dr. Wells had spent considerable time preparing Emma for this day, using play therapy and visualization techniques to help her understand what would happen in the courtroom. But even the most advanced child psychology couldn't fully prepare a 3-year-old for the pressure of testifying in a case that had captured national attention. As the small group made their way through the courthouse corridors, Emma's grip on her bunny tightened with each step. The imposing architecture, high ceilings, and formal atmosphere created an intimidating environment that seemed designed to make even adults feel small and vulnerable. For a traumatized toddler, the courthouse felt like a maze of echoing voices, serious faces, and overwhelming responsibility. At 9:15 a.m., the courthouse doors opened to allow the pre-selected gallery audience to enter courtroom 4A. Judge William Sullivan had made the unprecedented decision to allow limited media access, permitting 2 pool photographers and 1 sketch artist to document the historic proceedings. Television cameras were strictly forbidden, but the still photographers would provide images that would appear on front pages across America by evening. The courtroom itself had been modified for Emma's testimony. Court maintenance staff had constructed a small platform beside the witness stand, complete with a child-sized chair and a low railing that would allow Emma to sit comfortably while still maintaining the dignity and authority of the court. A box of tissues had been placed within easy reach, along with a small cup of water, and at Dr. Wells' specific request, a basket of stress relief toys that Emma could hold if needed. Marcus Sullivan entered the courtroom at 9:25 a.m., flanked by his defense attorney Robert Chun and a paralegal carrying multiple briefcases of legal documents. Sullivan, a 42-year-old construction foreman with graying temples and calloused hands, looked significantly different from the disheveled drunk who had been arrested at the scene 6 months earlier. His court-appointed suit was pressed, and proper, his hair neatly trimmed, and his demeanor carefully coached to project remorse and rehabilitation. But the transformation was superficial. Court records revealed a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades making increasingly dangerous choices behind the wheel. His first DUI at age 23 had been dismissed as youthful indiscretion. His second, 5 years later, had resulted in a suspended license and community service. His third had cost him his job and his marriage. Now, facing his fourth offense, and the deaths of 2 innocent people, Marcus Sullivan sat at the defendant's table, knowing that his entire future depended on discrediting the testimony of a 3-year-old girl. At 9:30 a.m. sharp, Judge Sullivan entered the courtroom, his black robes billowing behind him as he took his place at the bench. The bailiff's traditional call of "all rise" echoed through the packed courtroom, followed by the rustling of clothing and shuffling of feet as nearly 200 people stood in unison. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Sullivan announced, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom sound system, "this court is now in session for the case of the state of Arizona versus Marcus William Sullivan. Before we begin, I want to address the unusual circumstances surrounding today's proceedings." The judge's eyes scanned the packed gallery, taking in the media representatives, legal observers, and victims' rights advocates who had traveled from across the country to witness this historic moment. This court has granted an unprecedented request to allow a trained police dog to provide emotional support for our child witness. I want to make it absolutely clear that this decision was not made lightly, and it comes with strict conditions that will be rigorously enforced. As Judge Sullivan spoke, the courtroom doors opened quietly, and Detective Martinez entered with Rex walking calmly at her side. A collective intake of breath swept through the gallery as the magnificent German Shepherd made his way down the center aisle, his presence commanding respect and attention from everyone present. Emma, who had been sitting rigidly beside Dr. Wells in the front row, suddenly sat up straighter. For the first time since entering the courthouse, a spark of recognition flickered in her dark eyes. The courtroom fell into an almost cathedral-like silence as Prosecutor Amanda Foster approached the witness stand where Emma Chon sat like a porcelain doll, her small frame dwarfed by the formal setting around her. Rex had positioned himself exactly where Dr. Wells had predicted he would, close enough to provide comfort, but not so close as to interfere with the legal proceedings. His intelligent amber eyes remained fixed on Emma with the intensity of a guardian angel, reading every micro-expression that crossed her delicate features. Foster had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment. How do you question a 3-year-old about the most traumatic experience of her life? How do you extract testimony from a child who hasn't spoken in 6 months? The prosecutor's usual aggressive courtroom style had been completely abandoned in favor of something gentler, more nurturing, an approach that felt foreign but absolutely necessary. "Good morning, Emma," Foster began, her voice as soft as a whisper, yet carrying clearly through the courtroom sound system. "My name is Amanda, and I'm here to ask you some questions. Is that okay?" Emma's dark eyes darted nervously around the packed courtroom, taking in the sea of unfamiliar faces, the imposing judicial bench, and the formal atmosphere that seemed to press down on her small shoulders like a heavy blanket. Her grip on her threadbare bunny tightened until her knuckles went white, and her breathing became shallow and rapid, classic signs of mounting anxiety that Dr. Wells had warned them to watch for. But then Emma's gaze found Rex, and something remarkable happened. The dog seemed to sense her distress with an intuition that transcended species barriers. Without moving from his designated position, Rex shifted his weight slightly, angling his body so that Emma could see him more clearly. His tail moved in the barest suggestion of a wag, not the enthusiastic greeting typical of dogs, but something more subtle and reassuring. "I see you have your bunny with you," Foster continued, following Dr. Wells' carefully crafted questioning. Strategy. What's your bunny's name? The question hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful and fragile. Emma's lips parted slightly, as if she might speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she hugged her stuffed animal closer to her chest and glanced again at Rex, who remained as steady and patient as a mountain. Defense attorney Robert Shun shifted restlessly at his table, his legal pad covered with objections he wanted to raise, but couldn't without appearing heartless. Every instinct in his adversarial nature screamed this entire proceeding was manipulative theater, but challenging the testimony of a traumatized 3-year-old in front of cameras and a packed gallery would be career suicide. Foster tried a different approach. Emma, do you like ice cream? This time, Emma's response was barely perceptible, the slightest nod of her head, accompanied by what might have been the ghost of a smile. Rex's ears perked forward, as if he too had noticed this tiny breakthrough, and his tail gave another subtle wag of encouragement. In the gallery, Carol Peterson dabbed at her eyes with tissues that were already sodden from tears. She had cared for Emma for 6 months, had held her through countless nightmares, had witnessed the complete withdrawal of a child who had once been vibrant and talkative. Seeing even this small response felt like watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. Dr. Wells, sitting in the front row with her leather portfolio of psychological evaluations and treatment notes, made careful observations on a legal pad. Emma's body language was telling a complex story, fear and anxiety warring with curiosity and trust. The child's breathing had begun to slow slightly, and her death grip on the bunny had loosened enough that she could move one hand to brush a strand of hair from her face. "What about your favorite color?" Foster asked, her voice maintaining that gentle, non-threatening tone that had taken hours of practice to perfect. "Do you have a favorite color, Emma?" For the first time, Emma's eyes lingered on Rex for more than a few seconds. She studied his magnificent coat, the rich browns and blacks that created patterns like abstract art across his muscular frame. Her gaze traced the lighter brown markings around his intelligent eyes, the way the courtroom lights caught the subtle variations in his fur. The courtroom held its collective breath as Emma's internal struggle became visible on her small face. Her mouth opened and closed several times, as if she were testing whether her voice would work, whether the words that had been trapped inside her for so long might finally find their way out. Judge Sullivan leaned forward slightly in his chair, his years of courtroom experience telling him that they were approaching a crucial moment. He had seen thousands of witnesses take the stand, hardened criminals, expert witnesses, emotional victims, but never had he presided over testimony that felt so fragile, so potentially transformative. Marcus Sullivan, the defendant whose fate hung in the balance, sat rigidly at his table, his court-appointed suit unable to mask the tension radiating from his frame. His attorney had warned him that Emma's testimony, if she actually spoke, could be devastating. Traffic camera footage and blood alcohol tests could prove his guilt, but a child's words describing the night her parents died would carry emotional weight that no amount of legal maneuvering could overcome. Foster decided to try a more direct approach, one that Dr. Wells had suggested during their preparation sessions. "Emma, I notice you keep looking at Rex. He's a very special dog, isn't he?" This time, the response was unmistakable. Emma nodded, and for just a moment, her face lit up with something that resembled joy. Rex seemed to understand that he was being discussed, and his tail wagged more visibly, though he maintained his professional discipline and remained in position. "Rex likes you too, Emma," Foster continued, building on this small connection. "Can you tell me what you like about Rex?" The question was more complex than the others, requiring Emma not just to acknowledge a fact, but to express a preference, to find words for feelings that had been locked away since the night that changed. "Everything." Emma's breathing quickened again, But this time, it wasn't entirely from fear. She was fighting an internal battle between the protective silence that had shielded her from the world's pain and the growing trust she felt in the presence of this extraordinary dog who seemed to understand her trauma in ways that no human could. Rex sensed the crucial nature of the moment. His amber eyes locked with Emma's dark ones, and something passed between them, a communication that transcended words, a understanding that transcended species. The dog's expression seemed to convey a message of infinite patience and unwavering support. Take your time. I'm here. You're safe. The courtroom waited, suspended in a moment that would either mark the beginning of Emma's healing or confirm that her voice had been lost forever to the darkness of that terrible October night. The atmosphere in courtroom 4B had become so electrically charged that it felt as though the very air molecules were holding their breath. 27 minutes had passed since Emma Chun first took her place at the specially constructed witness stand. 27 minutes of gentle questions that had yielded only nods, head shakes, and the faintest glimmers of response. But Prosecutor Amanda Foster could sense something building, a tension in the room that suggested they were approaching a moment that would define not just this trial, but potentially the entire future of how traumatized children give testimony. In American courtrooms, Dr. Patricia Wells, observing from the front row with the trained eye of someone who had spent 2 decades studying childhood trauma, noticed subtle changes in Emma's physiological responses. The child's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow throughout the morning, was beginning to regulate. Her grip on the threadbare bunny had loosened enough that she could gesture slightly when Foster asked about colors and favorite foods. Most significantly, Emma's periods of eye contact with Rex were becoming longer and more frequent, as if she were drawing strength from the dog's unwavering presence. Rex himself had become something extraordinary to witness. A German shepherd, trained for years to maintain professional discipline in high-stress situations, had transcended his canine training to become something that defied easy categorization. He wasn't acting as a police dog. There were no criminals to apprehend, no contraband to detect. He wasn't functioning as a traditional therapy animal either, since he had no formal certification in that role. Instead, Rex had become something unique, a bridge between Emma's traumatized silence and the voice that legal justice desperately needed to hear. Foster knew that the next question would be the most crucial of her entire prosecutorial career. She had handled hundreds of cases, secured convictions against murderers, drug dealers, and violent criminals, but nothing had prepared her for the delicate responsibility of coaxing testimony from a 3-year-old who had witnessed the violent deaths of her parents. The prosecutor approached the witness stand with movements so careful and deliberate that she might have been approaching a wounded bird. "Emma," Foster began, her voice carrying the gentleness of a mother reading a bedtime story, "I want to ask you about something that happened a while ago. Something scary that you saw." The change in Emma's demeanor was immediate and profound. Her small body stiffened as if struck by lightning, and her dark eyes went wide with recognition and terror. The protective mechanisms that had kept her silent for 6 months began to engage, pulling her back toward the safety of muteness that had shielded her from having to relive the most horrific night of her young life. But then Rex did something remarkable. Sensing Emma's mounting distress, with an intuition that seemed almost supernatural, the massive dog rose from his designated position and took a single deliberate step closer to the witness stand. It was a movement that violated his training protocols, but Rex was operating on instincts far deeper than any human instruction. His amber eyes locked with Emma's terrified gaze, and his expression seemed to communicate a message that transcended species. "I'm here. You're not alone. I won't let anything hurt you." Judge William Sullivan noticed Rex's movement, but made no attempt to intervene. Despite his initial reservations about allowing the dog in the courtroom, the judge had become fascinated by the extraordinary bond developing before his eyes. In 30 years of jurisprudence, he had never witnessed anything comparable to the communication taking place between the traumatized child and the police dog. Marcus Sullivan, the defendant whose future hung in the balance, leaned forward at his table with an expression of growing dread. His defense attorney, Robert Chun, had spent months crafting a strategy based on the assumption that Emma would never speak. Physical evidence could prove Sullivan's intoxication and establish that he had run the red light, but without Emma's testimony, the prosecution would struggle to convey the human impact of his actions. A drunk driving conviction might result in a few years in prison. But if Emma spoke, if she described what she had witnessed that terrible night, the emotional weight of her words could ensure that Sullivan faced the maximum penalty under Arizona's repeat offender statutes. Foster knelt beside the witness, bringing herself to Emma's eye level in a gesture that made the formal courtroom feel more like a gentle conversation between friends. "Emma, sweetie, can you tell us who was driving the car that hurt your mommy and daddy?" The question hung in the air like a soap bubble balanced on the edge of a knife. In the gallery, Carol Peterson gripped her husband's hand so tightly that her fingernails left permanent marks in his palm. Court reporters, stenographers, and legal observers found themselves leaning forward unconsciously, as if physical proximity might help them witness history in the making. Emma's internal struggle became visible on her small face. 6 months of protective silence warred against growing trust in the gentle woman asking questions and the magnificent dog whose presence made her feel safer than she had since before the accident. Her lips parted slightly, then closed. Her breathing quickened, then slowed. She looked at Foster, then at Rex, then at the packed courtroom filled with strangers whose lives would be forever changed by whatever she might say next. Rex seemed to understand that this was the crucial moment. The dog's tail began a slow, encouraging wag, and he made a soft sound, not quite a whine, not quite a bark, but something uniquely comforting that seemed designed specifically to give Emma the courage she needed. And then, like the first crack in a dam that has held back a flood for too long, Emma's voice emerged. "Bad man?" The 2 words were spoken so softly that they barely registered above the courthouse's air conditioning system. But their impact was seismic. A collective gasp swept through the gallery as the reality of what they had just witnessed began to sink in. Emma Chun, the silent victim, who had not spoken a word in 6 months, had found her voice. Rex's response was immediate and joyful. His tail began wagging with genuine enthusiasm, and he let out a soft whine that sounded remarkably like pride and encouragement. The dog seemed to understand that Emma had achieved something monumental, and his celebration was infectious. But Emma wasn't finished. Emboldened by Rex's obvious approval and the gentle atmosphere that Foster had created, the 3-year-old lifted her small hand and pointed directly at Marcus Sullivan. Her voice, stronger now and carrying clearly through the courtroom's sound system, repeated the words that would haunt the defendant for the rest of his life. "Bad man." The courtroom erupted. The moment Emma's small finger pointed directly at Marcus Sullivan, and those 2 powerful words, "Bad man," left her lips for the second time, courtroom 4A erupted into controlled chaos that would be remembered in legal circles for decades to come. Judge William Sullivan's gavel struck the bench repeatedly as he fought to restore order, but the emotional avalanche that Emma's breakthrough had triggered couldn't be contained by judicial authority alone. In the gallery, spectators who had maintained respectful silence throughout the morning's delicate proceedings found themselves overwhelmed by the raw power of witnessing justice spoken in a child's voice. Carol Peterson, Emma's foster mother, buried her face in her hands as 6 months of suppressed grief and hope collided in a torrent of tears. Her husband wrapped protective arms around her shaking shoulders, his own eyes streaming as he watched. The little girl they had come to love finally find the courage to speak her truth. Dr. Patricia Wells, the child psychologist whose research had made this moment possible, sat transfixed in the front row, her professional composure cracking as she witnessed the most extraordinary therapeutic breakthrough of her 20-year career. Her hands trembled as she scribbled notes on her legal pad, trying to capture the clinical significance of what was unfolding while simultaneously processing the profound emotional impact of seeing Emma's voice emerge from 6 months of traumatic silence. Rex's reaction to Emma's testimony was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire scene. The German shepherd, whose training had taught him to remain stoic and controlled in all situations, abandoned every protocol he had ever learned in favor of pure, unbridled joy. His tail wagged with such enthusiasm that his entire body seemed to vibrate with celebration. He let out a series of soft whines and happy barks that sounded remarkably like cheers of encouragement, his amber eyes sparkling with what could only be described as pride in Emma's incredible courage. "Order! Order in the court!" Judge Sullivan commanded, though his own voice carried unmistakable emotion as he witnessed the historic moment unfolding in his courtroom. The judge had presided over thousands of cases, but nothing had prepared him for the profound impact of watching a traumatized child overcome her silence with the help of a police dog whose intuitive understanding transcended all conventional training. At the defendant's table, Marcus Sullivan's carefully constructed facade of remorse and rehabilitation crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. His face went ashen as the full weight of Emma's accusation hit him, and his hands began to shake with the realization that his fate had just been sealed by the two most devastating words he had ever heard. Defense attorney Robert Chun frantically shuffled through legal papers, searching desperately for some objection, some technicality that might blunt the impact of testimony that had just demolished his entire defense strategy. But there was no legal maneuver that could diminish the power of what had just occurred. Emma's words, spoken with the absolute honesty that only children possess, had cut through months of legal maneuvering and technical arguments to deliver a truth so pure and undeniable that it transformed the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. Prosecutor Amanda Foster fought to maintain her professional composure as she realized that her career-defining moment was unfolding before a packed gallery and pool photographers who would ensure that images of this historic testimony appeared on front pages across America by evening. She had spent months preparing for this possibility, but the actual experience of hearing Emma's voice break 6 months of silence was more emotionally overwhelming than any amount of preparation could have anticipated. In the media section, seasoned court reporters who had covered everything from death penalty cases to high-profile celebrity trials found themselves reaching for tissues as they witnessed something that transcended typical courtroom drama. The pool photographer, granted special permission to document this unprecedented proceeding, captured frame after frame of Emma's brave testimony, Rex's joyful celebration, and the emotional reactions rippling through the packed gallery. But the true significance of Emma's breakthrough extended far beyond the confines of courtroom 4A. Within minutes of her testimony, courthouse staff began fielding phone calls from legal scholars, child advocacy groups, and media outlets across the Chung nation. Word of the police dog testimony spread through social media like wildfire, with hashtags like #EMMA's voice and #JusticeWithRex trending nationally before the morning session had even concluded. Dr. Wells realized that she was witnessing the birth of a new paradigm in how the legal system could accommodate traumatized child witnesses. The research she had compiled on animal-assisted therapy in courtroom settings was suddenly being validated in the most dramatic way possible, and she knew that law schools and psychology programs would be studying this case for generations to come. The breakthrough moment also triggered an unexpected response from Emma herself. Having spoken those crucial words and seen the positive reaction from Rex, the adults around her, and even the formal courtroom environment, something fundamental shifted in the 3-year-old's psychological state. For the first time in 6 months, she seemed to remember that she had a voice, that her words mattered and could be heard without causing harm to herself or others. "Bad man hurt Mommy," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word as Rex's continued encouragement gave her confidence. "Bad man hurt Daddy. Bad man made the big crash." Each additional word struck the courtroom like lightning, and Marcus Sullivan visibly slumped in his chair as the child he had hoped would remain silent forever continued to speak with devastating clarity about the night that had destroyed her family and changed her life forever. Judge Sullivan realized that he was presiding over a moment that would reshape American jurisprudence. The successful use of Rex to help Emma overcome her traumatic mutism would inevitably lead to legislation, legal precedents, and fundamental changes in how courts across the nation handle cases involving child witnesses. As the morning session drew to a close, with Emma having provided more testimony than anyone had dared hope for, the full magnitude of what had occurred began to settle over everyone present. They had witnessed not just a legal proceeding, but a miracle of healing, courage, and the extraordinary bond between a traumatized child and a dog whose intuitive understanding had unlocked a voice that justice desperately needed to hear. Avalanche that Emma's 2 words had triggered was only just beginning, and its impact would be felt far beyond the boundaries of one Arizona courtroom. 6 weeks after Emma Chun's historic testimony echoed through courtroom 4A, the Arizona desert bloomed with unseasonable spring flowers as justice finally arrived for the Chun family. The same courthouse that had witnessed Emma's breakthrough now served as the stage for Marcus Sullivan's sentencing, a proceeding that would close one chapter while opening countless others in the ongoing story of how a traumatized child and a police dog had changed American jurisprudence forever. Judge William Sullivan, no relation to the defendant despite sharing his surname, had spent those intervening weeks reviewing legal precedents, consulting with child psychology experts, and fielding calls from law professors across the nation who wanted to understand the implications of what had occurred in his courtroom. The case had attracted international attention, with legal delegations from Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia requesting copies of the court transcripts to study how animal-assisted testimony might be implemented in their own judicial systems. Marcus Sullivan entered the courtroom for his sentencing hearing as a broken man. The confident facade he had maintained during his arrest and initial court appearances had crumbled completely in the wake of Emma's devastating testimony. His defense attorney, Robert Chun, had advised him that pleading for mercy was his only remaining option, though they both knew that Emma's words, "Bad man hurt Mommy, bad man hurt Daddy," had sealed his fate more thoroughly than any amount of physical evidence could have accomplished. The courtroom gallery was packed once again, but this time the atmosphere was markedly different. Instead of the tense anticipation that had preceded Emma's testimony, there was a sense of closure and justice finally being served. Victims' rights advocates filled the front rows, many of whom had traveled from across the country to witness the conclusion of a case that had become a symbol of how the legal system could adapt to serve its most vulnerable witnesses. "Mr. Sullivan?" Judge Sullivan began, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent dispensing justice. "You have been found guilty of 2 counts of vehicular homicide while intoxicated, driving under the influence of alcohol, and reckless endangerment. This court has considered your previous convictions for similar offenses, and I must tell you that your pattern of behavior represents a clear and present danger to public safety." The judge paused, his eyes moving from the defendant to the gallery, where Carol and David Peterson sat holding hands, having officially adopted Emma just 1 week earlier. The little girl who had once been too traumatized to speak was now chattering happily in the courthouse hallway, her transformation so complete that strangers found it hard to believe. She was the same silent child who had captured the nation's heart. Under Arizona's repeat offender statutes, the judge continued, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It is the sincere hope of this court that your incarceration will prevent future tragedies and serve as a deterrent to others who might consider driving while intoxicated. Marcus Sullivan's legs buckled as the sentence was pronounced, and court bailiffs moved quickly to support him as he was led away to begin serving what would effectively be the remainder of his natural life behind bars. His fate served as a stark reminder of how completely Emma's courageous testimony had transformed the trajectory of justice in her parents' case. But the true legacy of Emma's breakthrough extended far beyond the fate of one drunk driver. Within 3 months of her testimony, Arizona State Legislature had passed groundbreaking legislation officially known as the Emma Chown Child Witness Protection Act, though it was universally referred to as Emma's Law. The statute established formal protocols for using certified therapy animals to assist traumatized child witnesses, created training programs for court personnel, and allocated funding for specialized courtroom modifications. The legislation became a model for similar laws across the nation. Within 2 years, 37 states had passed their own versions of Emma's Law, and the practice of animal-assisted testimony had become an accepted part of American jurisprudence. Law schools added courses on trauma-informed legal procedures, and a new generation of attorneys learned to balance legal rigor with humanitarian compassion. Dr. Patricia Wells found herself at the center of a professional revolution. Her research on animal-assisted therapy in legal settings, which had once been considered fringe science, became required reading in psychology and law programs nationwide. She established the Emma Chown Institute for Child Trauma and Legal Advocacy at Arizona State University, funded by donations that poured in from people who had been moved by Emma's story. Detective Sarah Martinez and Rex became unwitting celebrities, though they handled their fame with characteristic professionalism. The Phoenix Police Department received thousands of letters praising their K-9 program, along with requests from law enforcement agencies across the globe wanting to understand how police dogs might be trained to assist in similar situations. Rex, still active in his regular police duties, had nonetheless found a second calling as an unofficial therapy dog for the courthouse, regularly visiting with child witnesses who faced the daunting prospect of testifying in difficult cases. Most importantly, Emma herself had flourished beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Her adoption by the Peterson family had been finalized with the same judge who had presided over her testimony, creating a beautiful symmetry that seemed to close the circle of healing that had begun in that historic courtroom moment. The 3-year-old, who had once been too traumatized to speak, now chattered constantly, filling the Peterson household with laughter and joy that they had never dared imagine possible. On warm Arizona evenings, Emma could often be found in the Peterson family's backyard, playing elaborate games with her collection of stuffed animals, while Rex watched protectively from the shade of a mesquite tree. The bond between the child and the dog had not diminished with time. If anything, it had grown deeper and more profound as Emma healed from her trauma, and Rex seemed to understand his role as her permanent guardian and friend. Their weekly visits to the police station had become local legend. Emma would arrive with drawings she had made for Rex, stories about her adventures at preschool, and an endless supply of questions about police work that Rex answered with patient attention and gentle nuzzles. The other officers had grown accustomed to hearing Emma's delighted laughter echoing through the halls as she and Al Rex played games that seemed to exist in a language only they understood. As Emma celebrated her 4th birthday with a party attended by the entire Phoenix Police K-9 unit, Judge Sullivan, Dr. Wells, and the Peterson family. It was clear that her story had become something larger than anyone had initially imagined. What had begun as a tragic accident had evolved into a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the healing power of unlikely friendships, and the extraordinary capacity of the legal system to adapt in service of justice. Rex sat beside Emma as she blew out her birthday candles, his tail wagging with the same enthusiasm he had shown in the courtroom months earlier. Their bond had proven that sometimes the most powerful testimony comes not from words alone, but from the courage to speak truth in the presence of unconditional love and support. The story of Emma Chun and Rex had become a beacon of hope for traumatized children everywhere, proof that even in the darkest moments, voices could be found, justice could be served, and healing was always possible.